On November the 4th, 1934, police were trying to identify a corpse found on Dartmoor the previous day. While a few miles away here at Widdicombe in the Moor, a slightly eccentric author was reading an account of the body's discovery in the Western Morning News. A combination of these events and another mysterious death, hundreds of miles away in Sussex, was to bring to light one of the most extraordinary and frustrating cases the police in Devon have ever had to face. Dartmoor has had its fair share of mysteries. Some fictional, like the Hound of the Baskervilles, some actual, like this one. Dartmoor is a true wilderness, dramatic and austere, a prehistoric landscape, savage and changeable, and yet peaceful and embracing. The discovery that started it all was made by John Bailey, a farmer from Higher Merripit, who was walking out with his dogs on Broad Down, north of Postbridge, when he literally stumbled upon the badly decomposed body of a man. It was lying in a clump of rushes at the head of a little stream at Rotor Marsh, between Drift Lane and Archton Newtake, about a mile from Postbridge Post Office. At first, John Bailey thought the body was the remains of an animal. But as he investigated his gruesome find more closely, he found a collar, a striped tie, a cobbler's knife, a candle, an empty brown bottle without a cork, and the man's left shoe on the ground beside him. And the victim had a blue and mauve silk handkerchief tied round his neck. Farmer Bailey made for the nearest telephone and called the police. Now, John Bailey rented the Newtake at Archton for the use of his cattle and visited it regularly, so he knew the body could not have been there for longer than a few weeks. In the victim's pockets, a manicure set and some small change were found, along with a watch with the minute hand removed. These were the only clues to the identity of the body. The body was badly decomposed, so it wasn't at all obvious whether this was a crime or just a case of someone getting lost and dying of exposure.
There are many cases on Dartmoor, big wide open space, you know, thousands of acres of open moorland, where people have been found in the past dead. Some of them have been recognised and some of them have not. One of the things which adds a lot of atmosphere to Dartmoor, I think, is the fog and the mist and the driving rain. And out in the Postbridge area, they get it even more than we do here, but very much part of the Dartmoor scene can be the moods of the weather, which can change very, very quickly. And hikers and people walking on the moors and travelling on the moors find this to their detriment very often, that suddenly down comes the fog on the top of the hills and the mist and driving rain. So, yeah, a place of many moods.
The body was removed to an outhouse in Postbridge. An inquest was duly held here at Postbridge on November the 5th, but was adjourned by the coroner for further investigations to be carried out. However, the body was too decomposed for a post-mortem to be possible.
Peat on Dartmoor is very acidic, so any body which was found in contact with the bog in winter, when this was found in November, would have been perhaps semi-submerged. It would certainly have had a lot of the acidic rain and bog material around it. That would have speeded up decomposition of the body. So consequently, after being found after several weeks, the condition of the body would have been in quite a frightful state.
The police suggested the body was not that of a man of the tramp class. It appears to be the body of a respectable man. So how are identifications made in these cases? Usually by clothes or objects found on the body, or by circulating a description.
Once the body had been located on Dartmoor, down near Postbridge, the Devon Constabulary advertised the fact that a body had been located, had given a full description to the media of the items which had been located on his body, and that appeared in the national press.
News of the discovery of an unknown man's body on the moor reached the Western Morning News, who printed an account of the story on November the 6th, the day that had been fixed by the police for a funeral. The account was read by Catherine Parr, a local author. Catherine Parr is buried here, in the churchyard at Widdicombe in the Moor. The headstone has her real name on one side and her pen name, Beatrice Chase, on the other. She was addicted to crime fiction, both as a writer and avidly reading it in her spare time.
I knew Beatrice when I was a child, and she was quite a forbidden lady, really. She was a great character of Dartmoor. She was eccentric, there's no ifs or buts about that, and she was a very prolific writer. She was, I suppose you'd call it a romantic novelist up to a point. But this particular happening out at Postbridge really struck her imagination, and she had this feeling that this poor unfortunate creature found out in the middle of Dartmoor, nobody knew who he was, whence he'd come or anything, and he was going to get buried out at Postbridge, and she felt for the parents, the unknown parents, and she thought she ought to go.
Beatrice, whose real name was Catherine Parr, attended the funeral of the unknown man at Postbridge on November the 6th, and even sent a wreath on behalf of the unknown mother. The coffin bore no plate or inscription, and even the death certificate had to be marked unknown. An unusual wreath of Flanders poppies was sent by local landowner Sir Courtney Bennett. The police had circulated nationwide a description of the corpse and the objects found with it. One of the people who read this description was Mrs. Howard of Warrington, whose son Walton had gone missing.
And Mrs. Howard had the opportunity to view the property and positively identified the manicure set as a gift she had given to Walton in the April of that year, and a local watchmender had also positively identified the repair marks that he'd made in that watch. So there was no question the property found with that body, whether it was Walton Howard's body or not, the property belonged to Walton Howard.
With this positive identification of the corpse now made, Miss Parr was intrigued by the varied contents of the man's pockets, not to mention the watch with the missing minute hand and the missing shoe.
I think this is a story that really sets the fiction writer's juices flowing. It's got all these ingredients, mystery, strangeness, unexplained circumstances, and of course at the heart of it a romantic novelist desperate to find the truth, to give a mother peace. If this had happened on my doorstep, I think I would have found myself in exactly the two minds that a writer always is faced in when you are confronted by a genuine tragedy. There is part of you that grieves for the families of those who are bereft and would do whatever you could to give them closure. And there is the other part of you, the writer, that goes, oh, wow, this is absolutely fantastic. And I know if I'd been faced with these circumstances, I would immediately not only have wanted to do something practical, but I also would have been weaving fictions around this to try to resolve it in my own head, to try to make sense of it. So it's that kind of dichotomy you have of where, you know, one part of you wants to behave like a decent human being and the other part of you wants to behave like a cannibal.
Miss Parr wrote to the Chief Constable of Devon, enclosing a letter to the man's mother in Warrington, asking him to forward it to her. It contained an account of the simple funeral that had taken place on the moor. Miss Parr received a letter by return from the man's mother at Grove House, Fernhead, Warrington, confirming that she believed that this was the body of her son, the family's only and much-loved child. He'd been employed as a tanner in Bolton, Lancashire, and regularly came home for weekends with his parents. Then, on August the 25th, 1934, without any explanation, he had disappeared from his digs. wearing a brown suit and a raincoat, and carrying an old suitcase. The family had appealed for information about their son in newspapers and via letters, but had heard nothing. Mrs. Howard had no idea how Walton might have reached Postbridge, as the family did not know a soul in Devon. Meanwhile, Catherine Parr, also known locally as My Lady of the Moor, retrieved the flowers from the grave in Postbridge. She ironed the ribbon and sent them to Mrs. Howard in Warrington as treasures from her boy's resting place. But the mystery was about to deepen. On November the 24th, 1934, 3 weeks after the discovery of the corpse on the moor, another unidentified corpse was found at the foot of cliffs at Beachy Head in Sussex. Nothing odd in that? Well, maybe not. But why was this body also missing a left shoe and wearing a watch from which the minute hand had been removed? So now the police had two bodies, one on Dartmoor, the other at Beachy Head near Eastbourne. Miss Parr was intrigued by the account of the case in the Eastbourne Chronicle. Apart from the shoe and the watch, the man's pockets contained £1 10 shillings in notes and 6 shillings and sixpence in silver change. He had a cigarette case marked GM, and these initials were also on his socks. There was no other means of identification. So was this second body connected with the corpse found on Dartmoor just 3 weeks earlier?
I'm not a great believer in this much of a coincidence. I would say finding another body in identical circumstances with an identical layout of all the property, identical damage to a watch, it's too much of a coincidence to be unconnected. I would say there has got to be a connection of some description.
So who then was the man who had died at Beachy Head? Eventually, the brother of the dead man turned up to identify the body. He said his brother, George Miller, was 31 years old and an unemployed ship's steward. He had no connection with Sussex, and the brother had no idea why he should have been there. George Miller was actually from Minster Road in Bolton, Lancashire, the same town from which Walton Hurd had disappeared. The press soon picked up on the similarities between the two discoveries, and in these times of international tension between Britain and Germany, there was talk of conspiracies and secret societies.
Was it possible that these two men had each been involved in a secret society, possibly originally imagining that they were going to join an English-British secret society, but finding afterwards that it did in fact have foreign connections, possibly to the point of it being a spy process prior to World War II, of course.
The name of German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was mentioned. The press was writing up a storm. Were these two men who had fallen foul of a secret society, and with the shoe and the watch a warning to others who might be considering treachery?
At first glance, this is a story that looks as if it's come straight from the pages of a Golden Age thriller. It could have come from John Buchan or Sapper or A.E.W. Mason. The mysterious death, the mysterious missing hand on the watch, the business of the shoes. Why did these men suddenly leave their homes and end up in parts of the country where no one knew they could be? But as soon as you start to probe a little further, you realise that these are not the chaps of which spy fiction was made. These are ordinary working-class lads from Bolton, northern lads, going about their daily business. These are not the James Bonds or the Richard Hannays. In order to earn your place in spy fiction, you had to be a jolly decent chap with a public school education and preferably some experience in the forces. This is where you start to break with the notion of this fitting neatly into the secret society spy thriller.
Meanwhile, back at Widdicombe in the Moor, our amateur sleuth, Miss Parr, otherwise known as Beatrice Chase, was determined to solve the mystery of the corpse on the moor. The first thing that puzzled her was that when found, the body had been clothed in a light suit, but the brown suit in which he left Bolton, the suitcase, and his raincoat have never been found. Catherine Parr was puzzled by something else about the case. When Mrs. Howard eventually sent her a photograph of her son, it was shown to the police officer who removed the body from the moor. And he was sure that it wasn't the man that was found. The family had now accepted that this was their son, Walton Howard.
If they were given to feel that this unfortunate body was their son, I'm sure they must have grasped straws and said, oh, at least we know what's happened to Walton and we can take him home. In a way, to have a body, it means it's the end of the story, so to speak, but there is some satisfaction. They've got possibly a grave that they feel they can go and put a few flowers in, and that was, I'm sure, what Mr. and Mrs. Howard were grasping at.
On January the 10th, the coroner reopened the inquest on Walton Howard in the village hall at Postbridge. Catherine Parr attended, as did Walton's parents. At the conclusion, the coroner recorded an open verdict.
The evidence, as I've read it, is very sketchy, to say the least of it, and it is impossible to reach, in my view, a definite conclusion as to what the circumstances of his death actually were. It is not definite in my mind that he actually died on the spot where he was found. He may, for example, have died of natural causes somewhere else and his body taken there. He may even have been murdered and his body taken there. It's possible that he may have wandered there, perhaps suffering from amnesia, for example, and collapsed and died of hypothermia. There is an endless possibility of the various explanations for his presence there and also his cause of death.
Miss Parr wrote a pamphlet called The Corpse on the Moor, a true mystery story about Walton Howard's death. In it, she raised a series of questions about the case and appealed to her readers for answers. Surely someone must know why Walton Howard had come to Dartmoor. Someone must have seen how he got to such a remote area of the moor without any means of transport. Somebody must know where he was from August the 25th until November the 4th.
I think it's tempting in a story like this to fall into the trap of looking at the big picture, but if this were a contemporary mystery, I would immediately be looking at the personal elements, the psychological elements. I would be looking at where this story's roots lie. And these stories' roots lie not at Beachy Head, not in the middle of Dartmoor. They lie in Bolton. That's where this story started. That's the common link between these two men, and that's where I'd start to look.
Of course, in this day and age, we have the expression serial killer. Could he have been the victim of a serial killer? Certainly in this day and age, we may well have gone down the road of making thorough and detailed investigations to either positively prove or disprove that. Of course, now we have the benefit of DNA, and that would have resolved the whole problem of whether or not the two bodies were connected.
To the investigators of 1934, without the benefit of DNA profiling or theories about serial killers, the most intriguing aspect of the investigation was the similarity of the two murders. How were the deaths connected? What is the true significance of the missing watch hand and the left shoe in both cases? Was this a glimpse into the savage retribution methods of a secret society? Or just an extraordinary coincidence?
From my point of view, I shall never be satisfied that it was Walton Howard. It's yet another of the wonderful mysteries of Dartmoor, which I don't think will ever be solved.
Miss Parr finished her pamphlet with the words, "If any reader can throw any light or make any suggestion about this mystery, I shall be glad to hear." Nearly 70 years later, It's a fellow crime writer who has a theory that, if true, would explain much of the mystery.
My own feeling is that this was actually a very personal story. Back in the 1930s, it wasn't just regarded as being socially not quite the thing to be gay, it was also illegal. Now, particularly in the class that these two men came from, the notion of being homosexual lovers would have made them instantly outcast. They would have been breaking the law, they would have been without friends, without family. Particularly for someone like Walton Howard, who was close to his family, this would have been a secret impossible to keep. So it's my belief that they decided that they would move away from Bolton to somewhere no one knew them, where they could set up home together. They could perhaps pretend to be cousins or brothers or colleagues working together in a business. And where better to go really than a part of the country where at that time of year it wasn't too difficult to find somewhere to rent. So here they are in the heart of Dartmoor, setting up their new life. And of course, as happens on these occasions, they have a row, they have a lover's tiff, and Walton storms out into the night. Something happens to him. We'll never know what, since there was no post-mortem. He may have fallen, he may have stumbled into a river and drowned. We'll never know. But George goes looking for him, can't find him, doesn't know what to do. And then, of course, the body is found. George is distraught. Life is not worth living without Walton. What can he do? He can't bear the thought of going on without him. So he packs up their things and he takes himself off to that traditional lover's leap to death, Beachy Head. And there he prepares himself to be reunited with Walton. And in a sort of strange tribute, a strange linking together of them at death, he remembers that the minute hand of Walton's watch had fallen off, and he decides that he will take the minute hand off his own watch so they will be united in this small way, and hurls himself over the edge at Beachy Head. His shoe comes off, and indeed one can't be terribly surprised about that because it's a pretty traumatic fall. And so I think this explains pretty much all of the circumstances of the case.
So is The Corpse on the Moor a tragic story of a relationship that went wrong? Or a murderous story of two men who fell foul of a secret society? Or is there another explanation for the discovery of those two bodies, linked by the circumstances of their death? At the end, there's perhaps only one incontrovertible fact. Like Catherine Parr, it seems. None of us will ever know the true fate or identity of the corpse on the moor. And what about the wreath of Flanders poppies? In peacetime, what did they signify?